Hey friends, welcome back to another episode of Theology and Raw. My guest today is Dr. Nadya Williams, who has a PhD in classics from Princeton University. She's also the author of this excellent book that we talk about in this podcast episode called Cultural Christians in the Early Church. She's also just finished a book that's going to come out next fall called Mothers, Children, and the Body Politic, Ancient Christianity and the Recovery of Human Dignity. She's a book review editor for Current, where she also edits the Arena blog. I really enjoyed this conversation. As you will see very clearly, Nadya is incredibly brilliant and extremely well-versed in all things related to Greco-Roman society, which is where we go in this conversation. We kind of go all over the map. So if you love history, if you love ancient history, if you love Greco-Roman history in particular, you will, I think, very much enjoy this fascinating conversation. So please welcome to the show for the first time, the one and only Nadya Williams. Nadya, thanks so much for being on Theology and Raw. I'm very, very excited about this conversation. So I get sent a lot of books. Okay, people are like, they want me to probably promote it on the podcast. Most of the time, I mean, I love to read. I wish I could read them all. Seriously, there's so many good books that come across my desk, but I'm just like, I just don't have time for that. So yours came across probably a couple months ago, and here I'll show it for my YouTube audience here. It's called Cultural Christians in the Early Church. And first of all, the cover killed it. So I was like, oh, this is interesting. You got the chariot with the WWJD license plate on it. It's brilliant. I picked it up and I couldn't put it down. And that's usually I just like, I might crack a book real quick and then like put it down. This one, I was like, I think I sat there and read like 2 chapters straight. I was like, this is really interesting. So anyway, thank you for being on Theology on Nadya. That was a long introduction.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a thrill.
So tell us about your background. You have a background in classics. How did you get interested in that? That's not something that every kid wakes up and says, I want to read Homer in the original language,
Yeah. Well, I was that kid who loved Greek and Roman mythology. So I remember reading just like surveys of mythology for kids when I was little. And then in high school, my family moved to the US when I was right before starting 10th grade. And I wanted to pick up a new language because why not? Like new country, I already have to like operate in English, which I sort of knew, but not super well. But I figured like, why not add another new language? And the only class that had an open slot was Latin. So it was like, sure, Alice in Wonderland learned Latin. So like, I can do this too. And it was so much fun. And I realized pretty soon after that I wanted to study classics in college. And then, one thing led to another. And here we are. Way too many decades later.
Way too many decades later. Well, where'd you move from? You're from Russia, right?
I was born in Russia. And then in 91, right before the Soviet Union collapsed, my family moved to Israel. So I grew up in a secular Jewish home. And then we moved to the US in 96.
How long were you in Israel for?
Almost 6 years.
So did you learn Hebrew as well?
I did.
So how many languages do you know?
Well, with classics, you have to understand, like you have to read a lot of languages. They will not get you, they will not allow you to get a PhD without that. So obviously like ancient Greek and Latin, everybody has to learn that. You have to know French and German, reading knowledge at least for research. Highly recommend Italian and Spanish, again, for research and so on. This, like biblical studies, you have to jump the same hoops.
I had to. German was a no doubter. Like that was like, there's a lot, especially New Testament, a lot of German scholarship. That was so hard.
It is. It's the hardest.
And academic, I would give an academic German text to a native German speaker and they're like, I can hardly read this.
Yeah.
So I had
a professor.
Go ahead.
I had a professor who joked that before there were computers, there were Germans, and it's so true.
French was easier it's hard to speak, in my opinion. My wife's from France, so she's fluent. I can never get the pronunciation stuff, but reading it, I didn't find too difficult. I took 1 year of French and I was able to, slowly work my way through an article. But German, I mean, I put hours and hours. Mm-hmm. And I remember that turning point to where I can just slug my way through an article with minimal dictionary. It's like, oh, I can get the gist of what this person's saying, but anyway, it's all gone. It's all behind me now. So wait, from Russia to Israel, I mean, that's right now 2 places of massive conflict. I mean, I didn't bring you on to talk about that, but
Yeah.
you must, I mean, yeah. What are your thoughts on all that? I mean,
It's heartbreaking. And a lot of the same people, you have the legacy of the Holocaust in Ukraine and all of that, and
mm,
realizing that a lot of the same people are living through painful memories all over again in multiple
yeah,
places.
yeah. Where in Israel were you? What part of the
The
country?
first couple of years we were in Tel Aviv and then in Rehovot.
Okay, I don't know where that's at.
It's if you drew like a line between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, it would be like
Mhm.
smack in the middle.
Oh, I lived outside of yeah, that's Highway 1, right? From Tel Aviv to
Basically, yeah.
Jerusalem. Yeah. So I lived 15 miles, it'd be west of west of
Mm-hmm.
Jerusalem off Highway 1 just for like
Okay.
4 or 5 months. It was on a moshav out there.
Okay.
Um so okay, so then you pursue a classics degree at Princeton University, right?
Yes.
That's
Mhm.
pretty out there. I mean, that's pretty like not easy to get into. So what was that program like? I mean, was
It
that
was
pretty
wonderful.
intense? I mean, you ate it up.
I loved it. I mean, in graduate school, a lot of it is just kind of like self-directing. They throw a lot of books at you and just tell you to like go read, and it was wonderful. And I had a superb cohort, like
Mhm.
fellow students. We would just meet once a week to read Greek and Latin together, just like extra nerdy things. It was
Yeah.
a great program.
And when did you finish? Is this like a few years ago?
2008.
Oh, it's been a while. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. And tell us about your dissertation. You mentioned it offline a little bit. I found it pretty fascinating. So,
Yeah, so I came to graduate school thinking I wanted to study Greek and Roman military history, and my dissertation was kind of combining the literary and the historical aspects of that. So I looked at soldiers speaking out against their commanders in Greek and Roman literature, just kind of and thinking, what does it tell us about societal attitudes towards soldiers challenging authority? Because we think of the Roman world like you will not challenge authority, right?
right.
And and yet there were moments where soldiers could do that and sometimes even got away with it, which is fascinating.
They did, so they weren't reprimanded immediately, head cut off the second they opened their mouth against their commander necessarily, or
Sometimes, yes, but it's fascinating that we see the fear of military revolts kind of going through Roman history. And you think, for instance, AD 69, the year of the four emperors, where you have soldiers proclaiming their commanders emperors, and suddenly you have soldiers kind of like governing the political structure of the empire without
Mm,
really knowing what they're doing. And the Roman historian
mm.
Tacitus tells us that that was the year that everybody discovered the secret of power. And the secret of power is soldiers have it.
Really? So prior to the year of the four emperors, the secret of power wasn't quite as discovered, or how would you? Yeah.
Well, it was the first time soldiers proclaimed somebody emperor and he became emperor. So that was
Huh.
just kind of the idea that soldiers can actually make or break somebody's
Yeah.
career in that way.
Wow. So my knowledge of kind of Greco-Roman history is extremely spotty. Like I've done deep dives in various areas, but nothing close to what you've done. So I might be asking a lot of just random questions along the way because I'm fat. I'm just one of my like if I could do it over again. Well, I've lived a good life. I lived,
Yes.
no regrets,
Yeah.
but looking back, I'm like, having a classics degree, even a undergrad or master's, would have been very helpful for the work that I find myself constantly do. I feel like I'm constantly in the Greco-Roman background, and having to play catch up or having to like say, okay, I'm going to read this chunk of Roman history or this Roman rite or whatever, but I can't spend hours and hours and hours just reading Roman history. Can you give us? I mean, this may be so basic for you, but for somebody that just when you sit, when they hear Greco-Roman, they just have this blurry like some ancient people back then, not even sure like what's the time frame. How does this relate to the New Testament? Can you give us a 101 kind of like just broad sweep of, let's just say, Roman history in particular?
Absolutely. So, in
Okay.
the middle of the 8th century BC, there's this tiny village on the Tiber, more mosquitoes than people. And for some reason, they like keep building, and next thing you know, well, not next thing you know, it's more like 3 centuries later, they slowly start expanding. And once they start expanding, they really take off. And a lot of this, we don't quite know like exactly why and how they did it. Perhaps a lot of it was defensive because they were surrounded by much more powerful city-states around, including the Etruscans. But anyway, once the Romans start expanding, they keep going, and there are various military reforms that make their army stronger. And really, by the time we get to like the late 3rd century, they are taking on Carthage. And that's probably the moment when everybody in the Mediterranean world is really paying attention. Like, these guys are really like somebody to watch out for. And at that point, there's still, the government is a republic. So you have new political leaders elected every year, and they're very much military commanders. Then
elected, like democratically elected, or just elected by elites at the top, or
so the American election system, where you have the electoral college, is very much akin to that Roman idea, where everybody in the citizen body is divided into these electoral units, and each unit equals 1 voice. The trick is the system is rigged to allow the aristocracy the preferred vote. So a lot of times elections would actually be completed before the lower classes like got to vote.
Okay.
And
yeah,
so
that's interesting. That's fascinating. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
And obviously only Roman citizens could vote. And not, most people weren't, right, percentage-wise?
Yeah. Although the story of the Roman Republic is both a story of expansion, so Roman expansion, but also the story of the expansion of Roman citizenship. Originally, it was only if you lived in the city of Rome, but over time, different people gain citizenship. And so by the time we get to kind of the decline and fall of the Roman Republic in the 1st century BC, like when you think assassination of Julius Caesar, I guess everybody probably thinks of Shakespeare at that point. But I mean, but you get to that moment and you realize, like, okay, this is not quite the Roman Republic that we started out with. And at some point, and historians debate, like, when exactly did the Republic fully die and the empire began? But at some point, let's say like late 1st century, we're really in the empire, and you have an emperor in charge of it all.
And
that's when Jesus is born.
Octavian turned Augustus, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So he's the first emperor, really.
So it's around, what, 30-ish BC when we go from republic to empire?
Yeah. I mean, the assassination of Julius Caesar is 44, Ides of March. Octavian rules for quite a significant chunk of time. He doesn't die until 14 AD. And then you have kind of the question of, like, how do you pass power when you don't officially have a title? But he does. And that's the moment when some historians say, like, that's the moment that marks, like, no going back to a republic.
Okay. And that's a major transition, right? Because now you have one person with loads of power, whereas before they deliberately were against that, right? Like the Republic was very intentional, right? I mean, they wanted the balance of power, and they were really fearful of having a consolidated one person. And now they have that very thing. Was there a lot of debates about whether, like, what are we doing? We're changing our government structure in a way that we didn't think was going to be a good thing?
Well, it was so gradual. The last century of the Roman Republic was just round after round of civil war by generals who were amassing all kinds of unprecedented power. Like one general who bragged, "I will stomp my foot and an army will spring up." It's like, well, this is not a very democratic thing to say, you know?
So Octavian, almost said Augustus.
Yes.
He, from what in the research I've done, he strikes me as socially fairly conservative, right? Like his daughter was kind of a wild woman, and he was just not. He was like the opposite of that. It's a classic like Baptist pastor, conservative dad, and the daughter kind of goes crazy and shames the dad. And that was around the time of Ovid, right? Who was
Yes.
You talk about social upheaval. He institute some marriage reforms.
He did.
He saw that when the family unit was getting out of control, when people weren't getting married, they weren't settling down, they're kind of sleeping around, like that wasn't good for the structure of society. So didn't he like give like tax benefits or something for people who got married and had kids or something? It sounds almost modern day, like some of these marriage reforms. Is that?
Yeah, so the law of 3 children. So if you were and he really only cared about the aristocracy, kind of senatorial rank or equestrian rank, so like upper crust. We want the good babies. We want more of those good babies. And if you had 3 kids, you were able to like breaks on inheritance taxes. But also just to be eligible for political promotion, you had to have 3 kids at least. But what's fascinating is that it didn't quite work out the way he wanted. It seems like Caratins, people, and that's something very modern indeed, the conversations, like how do you incentivize people to have more babies?
Yeah. So it didn't work out. So people weren't, they weren't having 3 babies, or they did and the benefits weren't there, or what was the?
Well, it seems like some of the people he really wanted to have at least 3 babies were not having at least 3 babies.
Okay. Yeah. Well, then you had the problem with the death rate, right? I mean, isn't something
and that wasn't factored in. Like if you had like say you had 3 babies and all 3 died, which by the way could happen in the Roman world, you still you were not penalized for that.
So the New Testament, I mean, Jesus comes on the scene right in the middle of all kinds of cataclysmic upheaval, I mean, there's the whole, my main area is in Jewish history. So even there, you're coming off the tail end of, the Maccabean revolt and, 80 years of quasi-independence. And then Pompey, 63 takes over Israel. And so just on the Jewish side, there was a lot, and the factions between Sadducees and Essenes and Pharisees and so on. And then you introduce this whole Roman side. I mean, this is tumultuous time. I mean, do you think this isn't God? This is intentional. It seems like, I don't know.
Absolutely. Well, that's the thing. Yeah. So it's in a lot of ways you think about the birth of Christ, and it's really like the worst possible moment for somebody to be born, in that place and time.
Yeah. All right, I want to jump into your book, Cultural Christians in the Early Church, a historical and practical introduction to Christians in the Greco-Roman world. One of the things you set up the book kind of confronting this idealized portrait of these early Christians. All they did was serve the poor all day. They gave away all their stuff. They were peacemakers. They didn't, believe in violence. And then and I have some of that. Like, I think if we can just go back to the early church, they're all just martyrs and they just put the sword on my neck, I don't care. But your book unveils a very real, maybe more balanced picture of Christianity. What led you to want to write this book? And then I would love for you to kind of summarize what are some themes you look at in it.
Well, initially it started as a book of recognizing that a lot of early churches were filled with sinners. And that's something that a lot of my students over the years, up until recently, I taught at a school in the Bible Belt. So a lot of my students were churched, but also having conversations with people at my church and realizing that so many of them had those idealistic expectations. And so initially it started as kind of a book about, the early churches were filled with sinners. And a few months into the project, it clicked in my mind that specifically it wasn't just that the churches were filled with sinners. They were filled with cultural sinners. And then I realized, there's a much closer connection to us than I had expected. So that was the element that kind of made the whole project kind of click in my mind.
Well, give us 1 or 2 examples of what kind of cultural sinner do you explore in your book?
So, for example, food. You have Paul talks a lot to the Corinthians about their assumptions about food, like what kind of things can you eat or can't eat, but also how they treat, for example, the Lord's Supper or their attitudes to drunkenness. And so you realize, and I get into that in the book, the cultural baggage that they brought with them, where in the Roman world, banquets meant a certain thing. And so they took that very idea of the banquet and imported it into the Lord's Supper. And as a result, suddenly you had something that was definitely not what Jesus intended. And the parallel I make to the modern world, the changing attitudes of the church, for instance, towards drinking. Like just 20, 25 years ago, alcohol was taboo in a lot of churches where it isn't now. And so the question is like, did we just realize something was a sin and it isn't now? Or is it more of a cultural kind of construct around like, what do we consider problematic? But also just a kind of modern attitudes towards like Chick-fil-A. I talk about that. Like all the jokes about Chick-fil-A is the Lord's chicken, the Lord's calories, they don't count. So like, what are we doing with this kind of language and line of thinking? We really try to... it's difficult not to be a theologian in everything you do, but sometimes you don't realize that you're being a really bad theologian in things that you're doing.
So that's just kind of the slowly absorption of cultural norms without like a rigorous, maybe theological evaluation of whether this is actually aligning with the Christian worldview. You mentioned the Roman banquet. What can you describe to us what would be a typical Roman banquet? Because when you said that, it just, I mean, 1 Corinthians 11 flashed up in my mind. I'm like, oh, wait a minute. Ooh, I think there's something here, because that passage, we read it as like we read one side of the telephone, like in the sense we're listening to one side of the conversation. We just hear Paul's words, but we don't really have a good picture of kind of what is it that he might be addressing. So yeah, what are some features of a good, solid Roman banquet back in the first century?
Yeah. So we think of all the good food, and some people got all the good food. But the way it worked, Roman society was so stratified, hierarchical, very rigid. And so in a good Roman banquet, yes, you can invite everybody, including like wealthy people, not as wealthy, even women, but you would seat people. They would be seated according to rank. So everybody knew when they had a place at the table, they knew exactly where they belonged in Roman society. And then the quality and quantity of the food and drink they would be served would correspond to their place in society. So you might have some really fancy food, but you're not going to serve it to the lowest of the low at your banquet table. They should be grateful they made it to the table to begin with. So that's great. And so Paul is outraged that the Christians would take this idea and bring it to the Lord's table, where, of course, like all of us are equally precious in God's eyes. And you can't just take this Roman construct and impose it on the Lord's Supper.
So 1 Corinthians 11, the famous Lord's Supper passage, what the main thing Paul's addressing is this kind of absorption of Greco-Roman social classification, this kind of social hierarchy. Is that the main thing that's going on there?
I don't know if it's necessarily the main thing, but it is definitely an important thing that is going on there. Yes, that these churches, even as they're welcoming everybody, as they should, are still imposing Roman expectations. So the idea that some of you go hungry while others are eating way too much, like that's the Roman banquet right there.
I read somewhere, and I'll see if this is true or not. I'll have the expert on the other line here. That the wealthier would basically not be working, or they would work minimal or whatever. Like they can get off work at 2, 3 or whatever. Like they can go start the banquet early, whereas the lower classes would be working long hours, and they, you know, if they even were able to come to the banquet, they would come much later. And somebody said that that's kind of the backdrop here, is you had, because Paul says wait for one another. And he, again, according to this perspective, you know, it was the wealthier people who were getting started early on the banquet. Maybe they had a few glasses of wine already. They start to get a little tipsy, maybe drunk, and they're eating all the great meat and stuff before the poorer people could show up. And he's telling the wealthier people, wait for the, you know, everybody to show up. Is that, in your opinion, does that fit kind of the context there with what you're talking about? Or
I think it does. Keep in mind that the idea of the Sabbath, having a day off, is something new that the Christians brought to the proverbial table. I mean, most of the ancient world, other than the Jews, did not have the idea of weeks as we think of it. So for the Romans, the idea of like a day off, it doesn't exist. But also the idea of work in our modern sense isn't quite the same. So for the aristocracy, if you're really wealthy, depending on your kind of, if you're senatorial rank, you're not supposed to be doing any sort of trading. You're only governing farms, which means somebody else is doing all the work for you while you live in the city. For people of kind of the equestrian census ranking, meaning like you're wealthy and probably do something related to trade, again, other than kind of like making key decisions, you're not, and networking, a lot of networking, you're not doing a whole lot else. Mind you, for these people as well, by bypassing pagan sacrifice rituals, they were sacrificing something, but they still had the kind of leisure to take a day off fully that perhaps a lot of the poorer members of congregations wouldn't have had. And keep in mind that early churches had the enslaved in them too. I mean, slaves don't get days off.
Right. That's crazy. No days off. So one day off was like a big deal. Typically we take 2 days off of, most people don't work weekends. So that's, I mean, just historically, that's pretty unprecedented, right? To have, you work 5 days a week and 2 days off is kind of the norm. When did that start? Is that from the Industrial Revolution or? I don't know.
I'm guessing that's a lot more recent. But even with the Industrial Revolution, I mean, factories worked a whole lot more than 40 hours a week. That's, but keep in mind, Romans did have days off. It just wasn't on the schedule of weeks. It was more like religious rituals for various gods. So the Roman calendar had plenty of days off. It's just that they weren't predictable. It wasn't like 1 day out of 7. And it was always a pagan god who was being honored that day.
Yeah, yeah. So the thought of a typical Roman high-class citizen walking by, peering in on this Christian gathering and seeing slaves eating next to people of equestrian or senatorial class, like the high class, eating the same portion, same food, sitting next to each other, would that have been just abhorrent or shocking or just what is going on? And disruptive, right? Like that's like what do you do? Like the Roman gods aren't going to look favorably upon this, right?
Exactly. Yeah. The whole idea of that rigid structure in Roman society, they certainly thought this was part of preserving order, not just here on earth, but kind of the divinely ordained order, that gods did not create everybody to be equal. So the idea of like the Imago Dei, these are all things completely incomprehensible. There's no language for that in Roman religion because that's just impossible.
Where do we see that, either in the New Testament or outside or after the New Testament? Where do we see the tearing down of this social stratification within the Christian community causing consternation among Roman elites? Is that something that we face quite often?
Yeah, one good example that I talk about in my book is Perpetua. She was martyred in the early 3rd century AD in Carthage with her slave woman, Felicity. So the idea of 2 women, a noblewoman, Perpetua, and her slave coming to Christ together and then being martyred together, like being held in the same jail and kind of receiving the same treatment and ultimately martyred together in the arena, that would have been seen as very revolutionary. And of course, the fact that they're women to begin with, that's subversive too, in a society where all the heroes were men.
Well, talk to me about that. So I've heard that the Roman elites would only kill people who had some kind of prestigious leadership kind of position. And isn't this an argument for at least this example? I always called her Perpetua. How'd you pronounce her name?
Perpetua.
Perpetua. I'm going to follow your lead on that. Perpetua. my knowledge after 70 AD starts to get a little vague, so I've barely heard of Perpetua. Does this show the fact that she was targeted to be killed, that she had some kind of and leadership? I don't want to read in modern debates about egalitarian complementarian necessarily, but like what can we draw historically from the fact that she and her slave, why did she have a slave too? So well, yeah, I guess there's two questions there. What does this tell us about who this woman Perpetua was?
It's really hard to know because all we have is her little diary and then the notes that somebody added to it before publishing, which is fascinating also. Just the fact that a document by a woman was published. But what we see is, in my view anyway, we see the local nature of it all. So we don't necessarily see these kinds of things from every part of the empire. And it seems like a local authority would make the decisions, like to what extent do we want to persecute and just how thoroughly do we want to do it? Are we trying to scare off the local church altogether? Is this a matter of concern? Because we have other documents like the famous letter of Pliny, the governor of Bithynia in the early 2nd century, where he writes to the Emperor Trajan and says, like, there are these Christians in my province. What do I do with them? They seem like really bad news. And Trajan writes back and says, you've got bigger fish to fry. So, whereas in this case, a century later, in a different province of the empire, clearly the local authorities are very concerned. So we don't get a full empire-wide persecution until the middle of the 3rd century, so later than Perpetua. And local attitudes just would have differed. It's really very much up to local leaders. What's fascinating is Perpetua and Felicity were both, they're identified as catechumens. They're still Christians in training. They were still going through the process of conversion. But they say they were being watched. Perpetua knew that somebody was following her around for weeks before her arrest. And it's really difficult to know exactly what happened. And one unanswered question is, did she lead her slave woman to Christ, or did Felicity convert first or get connected with the local church first and led Perpetua to Christ? Either one is possible. It's also possible that somebody else led both of them to Christ. We just don't get that answer.
So they were catechumens. So does that mean she couldn't have been like a leader, like a capital L leader?
No.
I mean, she was in her early stages of conversion.
Yes.
She but probably influential, maybe. I mean, why target her of all the different Christians in the area? What was? We just don't know. I guess it's kind of speculation, right? I mean,
well, she wasn't alone. It seems like there were other people who were being targeted. So when she and Felicity are martyred, there are other people who are martyred with them. It's a pretty large group that day.
Okay.
So it's just that Perpetua is the one who left us a journal, so we can get her side of the story.
Oh, so the fact that she stands out as a martyr is due partly just to the fact that it's her journal we still have, and we don't have anybody else's journal from that mass martyrdom that happened.
There's one other person who left some notes, and his journal is kind of combined with Perpetua's, and they're all published together with the notes from an unidentified person who edited this whole thing together. It's really, again, like so many mysteries. It's like layer after layer. You peel back, more questions emerge, but they're not leaders. Is what's clear is they're just regular converts, and it seems like they were targeted simply for being in the process of conversion.
This episode is sponsored by Dwell, a creative and highly engaging Bible app that reads scripture in dramatic ways. So there's lots of different Bible apps out there, and each one serves a certain purpose. What I love about Dwell is that you can listen to the Bible in over 20 different voices: male voices, female voices, American voices, British voices, East African voices, and many others. Some voices will read the Bible in a more dramatic fashion. Others are more calm and soothing. Some are formal and sincere. Others are reassuring and kind, and there's many others. What I love most about Dwell is its ability to break through the familiarity. So if you're like me and you've been reading the Bible for a while, its familiarity can sometimes prevent you from engaging the text in fresh ways. So with all the different voices and tones and background music, Dwell helps you engage the text and absorb the text with a renewed sense of wonder. And Dwell just released a new daily devotional called Dwell Daily. Each day is a fresh, thoughtfully crafted devotional that goes beyond just hearing scripture to immersing you in the word, praying it, meditating on it, and so much more. So if you're looking to deepen your engagement with the Bible this year, Dwell Daily is definitely worth checking out. So check out the Dwell app. Go to dwellbible.com/TITR and receive your 25% off discount today. That's dwellbible.com/TITR. Check it out. So this is kind of a side question, but something that I've often thought about, and I have seen a couple, maybe one classicist talk about this, that it's more of like a methodological historical question. Our knowledge of ancient Greco-Roman society comes from the literature that we have access to, largely. I mean, there's archaeology and stuff too, but mostly from the literature. Well, who's writing the literature? Well, almost all men. This is one rare example. And people who are literate, people who are elite. We don't have a lot of literature from like people lower class, literate people writing stuff, because that just was extremely rare. Maybe it didn't even exist. So what does that do to us as we're trying to get our historical knowledge of ancient Greco-Roman society? Is it's always going to be skewed, right? It would be like if somebody studied 21st century America and they're relying on literature left behind by like elite politicians or something. It's like, well, did they really even today you hear people that just have lived in, they've been in politics for 50 years and they lived in Washington DC their entire life, and it's like you have no clue. You start talking about people and it's like, you've never been to Iowa, you never worked on a farm in Kansas or something, or been at some sports bar in downtown Cleveland or something. You don't know the common person, like what's going on. And sometimes they talk and it's like, yeah, you're clearly out. You've been in politics way too long. Is that at all? I mean, what does that mean? Does that mean that our knowledge is really going to be kind of skewed? It's through the lens of the elite, or what do we do with that?
Well, I think that's an excellent question, and that's one that classicists did wrestle with. But here's what's so striking for those of us who look at the world of the New Testament in the context of the Roman Empire. Guess which text has come, the largest text, you know where I'm going, that has come to us from people who are not the elites, for people who used to be fishermen, farmers, whatever else. It's the New Testament. You have this massive document or set of documents written by people who were not the elites, telling experiences of people who were not the elites. And that's what makes it so valuable and beautiful, where Greco-Roman literature very much is from the perspective of the elites, because they're the ones who had leisure, time to write. And by the way, usually if they were writing something, it was for self-glorification. Julius Caesar didn't do anything without calculating what he was doing and why he was doing it and what he was going to get out of it. But here you have a document that was written by people who believed something was important, and that is why they wrote it. And even before you get into the conversations about the inspiration, divine inspiration of those texts, you already have something that is clearly very different from anything else in the Greco-Roman world.
I think I said that somewhere in one of my books. I think on I was writing on sexuality, and like we often read we read the New Testament against the backdrop of the Greco-Roman world. And I think I said, and I got this from a classicist that was primarily a classicist who kind of went into studying the New Testament. So he's coming at it from the different direction. And, I'm blanking on his name, the guy I'm thinking of, but, he said, we need to read the New Testament. We need to read Paul as Greco-Roman literature, not just simply against the backdrop of it. Like it's exactly what you said. It's here as a bunch of documents left behind, very well preserved, that give us the perspective of the non-elite, and that's a unique contribution to our general knowledge of Greco-Roman society.
Exactly.
Which is this is why when people correct Paul based on what we know about Greco-Roman society, that's when I'm like, well, wait a minute, that's a little backwards, like. Maybe we need to correct the elite perspective of Greco-Roman society by looking at the lens of Paul. Maybe Paul has a more accurate understanding of what's going on in the first century than, Livy or somebody. I don't even know if that when Livy lived, but
yeah. I think that's a good point. And Paul is fascinating. We were talking earlier before recording started about code switching, and Paul is really good at that, because he's got one foot in every world. The Jewish tradition, educated Greco-Roman world, but also he's hanging out with people who are not necessarily educated. He's tent leather worker, so he's very much in tune with multiple audiences and worlds and systems of knowledge.
Yeah, he does. He's a Roman citizen. He's Jewish, but he's raised, Tarsus. He's raised in kind of Greco-Roman world. He's obviously in his letters dealing with people who are coming out of that world or in the world. Being converted out of paganism. Okay, so you have the chapter I just read this morning. I have to read this title because your titles are awesome. This is chapter 8, The Altar and the Cross, Christian Nationalism in the Twilight of the Empire. So you, and again, just for my audience, one of the underlying themes is, just showing how some of our modern day challenges to Christianity were very much experienced in the early church. And we obviously, a big topic today, as you lay out clearly in your book, is Christian nationalism, and what the challenge that Christian nationalism brings both to our, American society, but also just the church in general. And you go back and say the early church was dealing with a lot of the same stuff. So could you summarize your chapter there, and what kind of Christian nationalism did the early church wrestle with, and how did they wrestle with that?
So we have to keep in mind that for the first several centuries, the church had always existed in the context of the Roman Empire. So it was very easy to say, clearly God ordained the church to flourish and grow in the context of the Roman Empire. And that is indeed what a lot of believers thought. So you get to 410 AD, the most traumatic event in centuries of Roman history. Rome is sacked by the Goths, and Augustine, across the sea in North Africa, writes his kind of magnum opus, The City of God, in response to that event, because Christians are kind of devastated. How could God let this happen to us? How could God withdraw his favor from the Roman Empire? What did we do? What is going on here? Whereas the pagans around, the few, the proud who still are left, are thinking, how could the Christians violate the peace with the gods that was originally in Roman religion and allow this to happen to us? So Augustine is responding to both groups in the City of God and is saying, well, God is in control. And by the way, the Roman Empire, this, and the city of Rome, that is not the city that you should be focused on. It's really, as Christians, we should be looking to the city of God. It's okay to mourn for the loss of this city, earthly city. You can grieve with those who suffered because there's real suffering involved, but you should not idolize it. And so that's what Augustine is really concerned with, is idols. It's okay to be patriotic. It is a good thing to love your country, but it's an even better thing to love God and place God first. And that's where Augustine wants to make sure people don't create an idol out of something here on earth that's not permanent.
And the fact that he had to write that shows that was a good chunk of the church, were they falling into that kind of political idolatry or nationalistic idolatry?
Again, it's difficult to, we can't just run a poll and see, what percentage of people believe this. But for Augustine to be saying this, it seems like it was pretty prevalent. And a lot of the first book of the City of God really reads as a response to actual conversations that he had with people, because a lot of refugees ended up in North Africa from Rome.
Oh, really? Why is that?
Well, so the Goths sacked the city, and that meant a disruption in food supplies. Rome was over 1 million residents at that point, and the city simply could not survive without regular food supply. So the sack of the city unleashed this whole like consequence of pretty awful things, including famine. And so at that point, a lot of people left.
So from a historical standpoint, how did the city get sacked? Was Rome kind of weak at that point? Was the military not that strong? Were the Goths just way stronger than people realize? Or and then so that's my first question. How from a historical standpoint, what happened? And then what I always hear about 410 sack of Rome, but what about 411? Like did the Goths occupy it, or what happened in the wake of after they sacked it? Like, because Rome still continued right after that. I mean,
it's a kind of a sacked, weaker shell of a city. But the answer to like the factors, it's sort of like all of the above. Keep in mind that Constantine had moved the capital to Constantinople a couple of generations earlier. So Rome is not even the capital of the empire anymore. It doesn't have, it has some structures. It still has a Senate house, but a lot of it is more for show. At this point, it's more a symbolic center than a real political one. And the Goths just kind of go on a rampage, sacking city after city. They kind of just march all the way through Italy. 410 was just not a good year. But it seems it's really fascinating. So it seems like they're essentially after money. Like Augustine emphasizes just how greedy they were. They saw this as a war of building wealth. But what's fascinating is also they were Christians.
The Goths were?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Whoa. So talk to me about, can you expand on that?
Well, Augustine talks about that because one thing that everybody later, after the sack, considers a miracle is that the Goths spared anybody who hid in churches in the city of Rome.
Really?
Yeah. So Augustine talks about that as this wonderful way that God preserved at least some people from the cruelty.
What kind of Christian were there? Were they like, because I know there was like Nestorians.
They're not Nicene. Yeah.
They're not Nicene. Okay. Yeah.
So, but they were at that point, they were technically, at least you could.
Okay.
Yeah. They were Christian enough to respect churches.
Okay. Maybe not super well acquainted with the Sermon on the Mount, but they were of the religions that
clearly not Anabaptist leaning,
Where is, like, in the modern map, where are they from, the Goths? I know it's the north, right?
Yeah, we're thinking, yes. So we're thinking people, keep in mind that the Romans have kind of conquered most of that section of the world. So what we're dealing with in a lot of cases are, when we talk about the Goths, are people who were familiar with the Roman world, with the Roman military. Some of them had fought in the Roman military. And then as the empire is kind of fragmenting and weakening, they strike off on their own. And so that's where it gets really muddy.
Okay. And it's modern day. Would it be like the Goths from like Switzerland area or east of Switzerland? I'm just trying to, I don't have a map in front of me, but
yeah,
like just north of Italy, northeast, or okay. Can you take us back? So let's go pre-Constantine. The church goes from a tiny little religious sect, hardly noticed by Rome, to becoming big enough to face widespread persecution in the mid 3rd century, right? To being, going from, what are the stats you gave? 10% of the Roman Empire in 300 to 50% by 350 AD. I'm just pulling. I don't have.
Yes.
I think it was.
I think that's the numbers, and I'm getting these numbers from Rodney Stark, who has probably done some of the best kind of estimates of this sociologically. Yeah.
Okay, so it's been years since I read him, but yeah, his book was fascinating, blew my mind
Yes.
from a sociological, historical perspective. Why did Christianity grow? It's been 15 years since I read it. If I remember correctly, well, let me just ask you the question. What for just from a historical, sociological perspective, why did Christianity grow from this persecuted minority to all of a sudden now the most popular religion in the empire?
So, one analogy that I made in the book, during the pandemic, that shut down spring of 2020, a modern sociologist posted on Twitter something like, the other countries in the world have safety networks, the US has women. I think it was Jessica Larco. And what I'm seeing, and what I think Rodney Stark had noted, is in the Roman Empire, people could have said, the rest of the world has no safety networks. The Roman Empire has Christians. So that's what it is. In a world that was very cruel, had no safety network, if you were suffering, you probably deserve it kind of attitude. And suddenly here are Christians in the age of persecution, in the age of a pandemic, because the third century crisis in the Roman Empire was a really awful, awful time where all kinds of things are happening. And the Christians in the middle of it all are ministering to other people. Are they doing it perfectly? No. I mean, we see their pastors, bishops, writing about how people in the congregation had to be more loving and kind to their neighbors. But the point is, they were much more likely to do it and do it lovingly than Romans. And as a result, people noticed.
So when the average Roman person was suffering, down on their luck, hungry, maybe facing, starvation, they knew that the Christians would care for them in general, not perfectly, but
in general, yes. So this kind of idea, and especially this comes through in the mid-3rd century, where we have a pandemic added to everything else, and it was a pretty horrifying, terrifying time where it was clear that it was highly contagious, and the idea that the Christians would care for the sick and the dying when anybody else would not.
This is is this right around? Is it the Diocletian persecution? Is that the
earlier? So this is Dacian persecution and the Valerian persecution. So we're talking 250s. And one of the sources, the best sources we have for this, is Cyprian of Carthage, after whom this plague was named, the plague of Cyprian. Poor guy. Talk about the irony. But he wrote so much about exhorting his congregation to care for the sick and the dying, and it seems like it really worked. They really listened. So this pastor who just really had a heart for caring for others.
So Cyprian had a huge influential voice to motivate Christians at that time to really live out, what the New Testament says, right?
Yeah.
Is that where there's that famous quote, and I can't remember, I don't think it's Tacitus, it might be, I'm wondering if it's during this time when some Roman leader says they not only care for their own poor, but they care for our poor as well, or something like that. Is that?
Ooh, that rings a bell.
Yeah, I can't remember. I wonder if it was during this time, because it seems to fit kind of what you were saying. It's just that,
we have versions of that in multiple sources, but
really,
yeah, that's because it seems like that was a refrain. That's a constant refrain in the writings of early Christian bishops, because guess what? The church needs those reminders all the time. Even Cyprian himself, multiple times, he keeps coming back to this. He wrote a treatise on almsgiving. He wrote a treatise on the plague, caring for the poor, and the dying and the sick, and all of that. So just all of those reminders, they keep coming up. Tertullian wrote on this. Obviously, Augustine wrote on this later. Yeah. So it is a massive kind of emphasis. And it's striking because we have a lot of manuals and guidebooks in the ancient pagan world, but we never have a manual on how to care for others. Whereas in the Christian tradition, you have versions of that, and manual on almsgiving, or how to care for single women in the church, and so on. It's like you suddenly have all of these books or treatises on here's how to love others well. No Roman would ever have written a text like that.
Really? Wow. Yeah. And And what about the Christian view of women too was, I think Rodney Stark wasn't that one of his main points, is that the church so valued women alongside equal as men that was one of the, in his perspective, why the church grew as well. Have you found that to be true as well?
That it was attractive to women just as much as men because of the place it afforded them. You look at the Roman world, and from a formal perspective, women had no power. I mean, behind the scenes, sure, some aristocratic women wielded plenty of power. But the point is, from an official standpoint, you're not a citizen.
It does. Oh wait, women couldn't be citizens?
They're not. They sort of, it's this nebulous status where you're a citizen, you were a citizen, but you're not a voting kind of citizen, because any sort of political power was connected to your potential to be in the military.
Oh, really?
All through the ancient world, Greece and Rome, like any of those ancient Greek city-states down to the Roman world, citizenship and voting, at least full citizenship rights, were connected to your potential to be in the military. If you can't contribute to the army, sorry, too bad.
So the military was kind of the thread that held the whole thing together. I mean, that was huge. How did so I remember doing some research on this a while back on kind of military service and the early church and how they really wrestled with, can Christians serve in the military? What if somebody in the military is converted? Can they remain in the military? Like how did the church deal with that from, let's just say, AD 100 to Constantine? Like what were some of the conversations happening along those lines?
I mean, it seems like a lot of it was individual decisions. Like people had to figure out, I mean, look, even in the New Testament, we keep seeing centurions. They keep, like, now you see them, like they keep popping up in the story. Centurions who are observing Jesus and suddenly realizing, like, wait a second, this is true. So from very early on, we see people in the Roman military coming to Christ or embracing the faith. The Romans didn't really pay serious attention to it until Diocletian. The last major persecution under Diocletian is specifically targeting Christians in the military, which tells me that at that point, there were quite a few of them. Now, the big problem with serving in the Roman military from a Christian perspective is that you had to swear an oath of allegiance to the emperor that effectively recognized the emperor as a god. So that's tricky. Yeah.
And I mean, there were so many pagan rituals woven into military service, right? I mean, I think one scholar said that, a Roman military leader was a virtual pagan priest. Like
he was.
So how did, I guess maybe is that precisely what they were wrestling with? Like, is this compatible with the Christian faith? How much accommodation are we allowed to make before we just completely renounce our allegiance to Jesus based on how many pagan rituals we're a part of? Or
well, and Nadya Gupta has written about how Jews have wrestled with kind of related issue, not in the military necessarily, but in general, like how can you be a citizen of the Roman Empire and still be a faithful Jew? And what he argued is that a lot of people would simply praying for the welfare of the emperor rather than praying to the emperor. So there is that distinction. And my guess is that some Christians at least made that distinction in their own practice. But during a time of persecution, for instance, if somebody were examining these rituals very closely and asked, like, well, are you actually offering incense to the emperor as a god that he is supposed to be? Well, that's when you're going to run into problems.
And so that's the Diocletian persecution. And just so we're like late 3rd century now, right? 290s ish or 280s?
Starting in the 280s,
280s. So the persecution was against Christians in the military who were basically not giving their full allegiance to the divine Caesar or pagan practices Okay. Well, that makes sense. Okay. And then, so Constantine comes on the scene, and this is the famous, right? He's quote unquote converted-ish. Do you have opinions on that? I know. Yeah. It seems like an American president to win votes is going to, not, tip his hat to whatever religion is going to get him the most votes from his base. Was he actually like?
See, I wouldn't take it. I think there's something genuine there, because Christians at that point are only 10% of the empire. So if you're going to like really try to win votes, you're not going to go with the 10%. You're going to go with like the 80 or 90.
That's true. Yeah.
It's so it seems like he genuinely had some curiosity about it. But as you noted, like you were converted-ish. I think that's a good way to put it, because he was not baptized until he was on his deathbed.
Okay.
So he cared about the church. He clearly had some sort of, however, like partial conversion experience early on in his life. And he also meddled a lot in the church. He really wanted to be involved because, Roman emperor, you care about religion in the state. Yeah.
Wasn't his mom a devout Christian?
She was, yeah. So she converted, and it's fascinating because she seems to have had a very genuine faith. And there have been some theories about when did she convert? Did she convert around the same time as Constantine? Was she a Christian all along? I saw one theory, and I have I've seen zero shred of evidence for it, that Constantine's father was a closet Christian. Okay. That seems more like a wishful thinking, but.
So that's true. Going back to my stats, I mean, if in 300 AD, 10% of the empire, his conversion is what, 313? Is it right?
Yes.
Right around the Edict of Milan. And didn't he have like a vision of a cross or something, and then that helped him win a battle? So some kind of experience happened, right? So it wasn't just like being a Christian is going to be politically advantageous. Statistically, it wasn't yet.
No. Well, and the fact that he made all of his soldiers put this cross on their shield, which surely some of them would have been kind of like, this guy has lost his mind.
Huh. Interesting. Okay. Yeah.
But the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312, where he has this major victory that allows him to become emperor.
So then his life after that wasn't necessarily a Jesus-shaped cruciform life necessarily, you're saying? I mean, that is, so why do we question his conversion then? Is it because
it's, well, again, the fact that he wasn't baptized until he was on his deathbed, to me, that's kind of a red flag that perhaps he wasn't fully converted. But it's
back then, it's not like Baptist. I mean, it's, if you're a convert, you get baptized. Like that just goes hand in hand. Yeah.
But there was also a popular belief, obviously theologically problematic, but the idea that you needed to wait until your deathbed to be baptized, because then you were guaranteed heaven, since baptism washes away all your sins. I mean, in a certain way, it makes perfect sense, right? But yeah.
It's pragmatic.
Very pragmatic.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
Hedge your bets carefully.
Yeah. Well, Nadya, I feel like I should probably wrap things up, but I feel like I have my personal scholar here, and I have so many other questions. But maybe I'll shoot you an email if other questions come up. But your book, so I said offline. I mean, your book is extremely well written. It's a rare feat in incredibly thorough scholarship, as anybody listening can probably assume by now. But it's written so well. It's so fun and engaging and funny and interesting, and it's a rare combination. So thank you for this book. You're working on another one, right? Or did you already finish your next book?
I just finished. Yeah, my next book is coming in October. So it's Mothers, Children, and the Body Politic, Early Christianity and the Recovery of Human Dignity. So that's coming from IVP Academic in October.
So is that going to be a little more academic than this one, or about the same kind of feel?
It's the same feel.
The same feel. Okay. Awesome. Well, thank you, Nadya, for your work, and thank you for the interesting conversation. Really appreciate the work you put into this.
Thank you. This was fun.
This show is part of the Converge Podcast Network.